A Pole now sits in St. Peter's seat. He is the heir to an apostolic church that is also Roman. Great popes of the 5th century were Roman of the Romans. They saw their spiritual powers as superior to those of the emperor, but they could not and did not imagine a world in which the empire had no part. To them, there was one empire, and within it, one church. In the year 476 AD, the last emperor of the West was deposed by a Gothic general. Italy became a barbarian kingdom. But the idea of Rome did not die. Was it not prophesied that the death of Rome was the death of the world? It could not die. Not even the barbarian Goths wanted it dead. Every Goth wanted to be a Roman. No Roman wanted to be a Goth. And so the empire lived, preserved as a memory of a glorious past. Its heroes were dead men. Many of the popes came from senatorial families, the born-to-lead civil servants of empire. Popes would not dare ascend St. Peter's throne without having their election ratified and approved by the emperor. This was the age-old custom. They continued to believe that the secular glory of Rome was part of God's providential ordering of the world. They stuck firm to the old religious doctrines, the truths of Peter about God, the Trinity, and the nature of Christ. Nothing can be changed unless it is handed down. Nothing can be changed. Nothing should be changed. This was still Rome, but it was old Rome. Everything had changed. There was now a new Rome. The political center of the empire was now in the east. The new Rome was Constantinople. By the end of the 5th century, the emperor was making increasing claims to authority over the church. Pope Gelasius, Roman-born, would have none of it. There are two powers by which this world is ruled: the sacred authority of bishops and the royal power. Of these, the responsibility of the bishops carries most weight. This was not the sort of language the emperor was accustomed to hearing. Things got even worse when in the lands of Syria and Egypt, new heresies took root. The nature of Christ continued to torment the minds of theologians, especially in the Greek-speaking world, a language more subtle in theology than the clear-cut Latin of the West. How, they asked, could human nature be united with God, but not absorbed in Christ? Surely the incarnation had produced a unique being. In Christ, they argued, the human and divine were fused in one nature. In Egypt and Syria, this one nature, or Monophysite teaching, spread. But the Pope in Rome held rigidly to the old beliefs that Christ had two natures, truly human and truly divine. The emperor, based in Constantinople, could not afford to upset these believers of the land of Egypt, then the breadbasket of the empire. When riots broke out, a new pope, Hormisdas, was summoned to sort out the differences. His response was predictably conservative. Only the beliefs spelled out in Nicaea and Chalcedon were true. And it was Rome, the Apostolic See, that had always preserved the true faith. The split between East and West had shown itself. For the papacy, things were no easier in Italy. These marshlands are a formidable barrier to any army. They protected the city of Ravenna, now the capital of Italy. Here ruled the emperor's representative, a Goth, a barbarian, and a heretic. And there was a new emperor, the Mercurial Justinian, a demigod. Many of the churches here have a distinct Eastern tang, a reminder, if needed, that Constantinople, not Rome, was the center of power. In the hothouse atmosphere of the court of Constantinople, a theology of empire had evolved, which raised the emperor far above any bishop, even above the Bishop of Rome. In all the churches, everything is imperial. Even the figure of Christ is dressed in the purple robe of emperor. In Ravenna, Justinian's mosaic images survive. The apostles and saints of the church are depicted as Roman senators. This is Christianity on the side of the big battalions.
The Emperor Justinian believed that he was God's representative on earth. The position in the Roman Empire was that the Roman Empire and the Christian church coexisted. And the position of the emperor and the pope was really set out by the Emperor Constantine, who said to a church council, "You are the bishops for everything internal to the church, and I am the bishop for what is external," by which he meant the church, headed by the pope, decided doctrine. The emperor enforced it, and that had always been the position. But Justinian took it one stage further. He legislated independently on doctrine, and this brought him into face-to-face conflict with the papacy, which was very difficult to resolve in any compromise setting. And the reason he did this was to try and resolve the Monophysite controversy, which was splitting his empire.
It was even a danger to his court and his family. Justinian himself was an Orthodox Catholic. He fully expected his priests and bishops to do his bidding. His wife, though, Theodora, she was some lady, with a lurid sexual reputation for wearing out relays of athletic young courtiers. She laid herself open to easy condemnation. But she was far more than a sexual, dumb brunette.
Theodora was one of the most remarkable women in the ancient world. She started out as a dancer and actress, which is code for prostitute, effectively. She'd been the mistress of the governor of Africa. She'd borne 2 illegitimate children. Justinian fell head over heels in love with her. She was his consort and his right hand. But the crucial thing was she was a Monophysite heretic, and her husband was Orthodox. And so at the very heart of government, there was a religious split at a time when these splits were vitally important for the unity of the empire.
Throughout Justinian's reign, the Monophysite heresy haunted him. Theodora, even she could not be converted. Another thorn in his side were the heretical Goths. They at least could be answered by the army. For 20 years, the campaign to recover Italy raged. There was no joy at its ending. Justinian left Italy depopulated and impoverished. A third of its population had perished. This was the Italy inherited by Pope Gregory the Great. He faced just as bad a mess in Rome. a city left to the crows. This is Gregory's own description.
She that once appeared the mistress of the world, we have seen what has become of her, shattered by everything. She has suffered from immense and manifold misfortunes, the desolation of her inhabitants and the menace of her enemies. Ruins on ruins. Where is the Senate? Where the people? All the pomp of secular dignities has been destroyed, and we, the few who remain, are menaced by scourges and innumerable trials. No more Senate, no more people, but for that which still survives, sorrows and groanings multiplied every day. Rome is deserted and in flames, and as for her buildings, we see them fall down of their own accord.
In Gregory's opinion, the decay of imperial power was a sure prelude to the end of the world. Yet, behind that gloomy vision, there was a lucid, calm, and practical mind. Here was a pope who could work miracles. On entering the church, Gregory renounced worldly wealth, selling his inheritance in Rome and turning his father's house on the Cliva Scowry into a monastery. The site is still there, and still a monastery. Gregory never wanted to be pope. He preferred the monk's life. A papal legate in the imperial court in Constantinople for 6 years, about the only thing Greek that appealed to him was the Retsina wine. So profound was his impact that even the chants used in worship were named after him, whether he composed them or not. His simple papal chair remains. Simple his chair, but not his deeds. He supervised the administration of the church with care and efficiency. When a beggar died of hunger on the streets, Gregory held himself responsible. Fittingly, alongside the monastery, a hospice exists. As an abbot ruled the monastery, so Gregory cared for all the needs of the people of Rome. They were his flock. The aqueducts destroyed by war needed repair. Gregory repaired them. There was new life coming back in Rome. And who paid for all this improvement? Here in Sicily, Gregory had inherited vast estates. He gave them all to the service of the church. Money was even used for the payment of the emperor's army in Rome. There was no help coming from Constantinople. What the state used to provide, the Pope must now pay for. Justinian's defeat of the Goths had simply given open access to other invaders, the Lombards. They pushed in and settled in the Italian peninsula. The magnificent church of Monza in northern Italy is tribute to Gregory's diplomatic skills in dealing with these invaders. The Iron Crown of the Lombards is still held here. In Gregory's day, it was worn by an Arian heretic. Gregory detested him and his beliefs. But his wife, Theodolinda, she was an Orthodox Catholic. Gregory was a shrewd politician and realized that through their queen, the fearsome Lombards might well be converted to the ways of the church. He showered her with gifts. A wonderful gospel book studded with gems. jewels of all sorts. Even his personal crucifix was given to her. A jar containing, it was said, wine from the wedding at Canaan is presented by the bishop. This was 6th century politics, and it worked. With the king's death, his son ascended the throne. The Lombards had their first Orthodox Catholic king, one of Gregory's flock. Monza is testimony to success. Not everything was to work out so well. The Celtic lands on the western outskirts of Europe. This part of the world was largely unconquered by the Romans. It lay beyond the empire. Here were churches over which Pope Gregory had no real influence at all. It was a micro-Christendom which had evolved its own very distinctive style.
When Patrick arrives, whenever he arrives, let's say in sometime in the 5th century, he's doing something that no Roman cleric has ever done before. He's taking the Christian message beyond the limits of the Roman Empire. And that's what makes Patrick unique. Irrespective of whether you regard Patrick as being the person who brought Christianity or not, that doesn't matter. He has such a strong tradition in Ireland that's established anyway. But the fact that he brought Christianity to a people that had never known it before and that had never been part of the Roman Empire is in itself something quite unique. And it's because of their difference, it's because of the fact that they were never in the empire, that the later Irish church is peculiar, because the way Irish people do things is the way they had done things before, just with a slight twist for the purposes of Christianity. In other words, Christianity is added as a sort of superstructure or veneer on top of the way that Irish people did things before that.
The Irish took enthusiastically to monasticism and monkish learning. It took on a form less like the orderly and regimented houses of the continent and was more like the idiosyncratic monasticism of the East. It was peculiar but staggering in its output of scholarship and art. The famous Book of Kells, one of the most outstanding illuminated manuscripts of the world. Vivid and subtle. Full of Celtic whirls and patterns, it was far removed from Rome or anything Roman. Among the differences was a distinctive way worked out by the Irish monks of celebrating the date of Easter. In calculating the greatest of all the Christian festivals, Rome and Ireland were at odds.
Rome, generally speaking, went nuclear when it heard about the Irish way of doing things. That's to say, we know that from a very early date, that's to say in terms of Columbanus, he was accused already by about 600 by Frankish bishops of being heretical. He was called to a synod. He was told to come and explain himself. He realized that they were ganging up on him, so to speak. So he beat them to the punch. He took a sort of preemptive strike against them and went directly to Rome. And he wrote the first of his letters, his most famous letter, the first letter to Gregory the Great, or Gregory the First, is addressed precisely to that subject of Easter. But it's a remarkable document because Columbanus more or less lays it on the line to the Pope and says, look, you are recommending this table of yours to us. We have tried it at home. We've looked at this. Our mathematicians have been through it, and it's wrong. It's crazy. It doesn't work. So we're sticking to our table, and if you have any sense, you'll do the same. You'll follow ours. Now, it's a very striking document because it shows a degree of self-sufficiency and confidence which you don't, for example, expect of the Catholic Church in this country nowadays, for example. Unfortunately, we know of no reply. The letter almost certainly arrived in Rome, but either because it was so extraordinarily forthright and so on, either the Pope didn't reply at all or the reply is lost. But we do know that for some years after that, the Irish did persist in their ways of calculating Easter according to their Easter table, and the Continentals did it their way.
The Irish deference to Peter did not necessarily involve obedience to his successor. Patrick and the other Irish missionaries had envisaged a church organised under the episcopal structure common in the Mediterranean world. But the strongly tribal organisation of Irish society militated against that as well. Here, remoteness and hardship were of the essence. Monastic life was conceived as part of a penitential wandering or pilgrimage for Christ. But in England, Gregory was to have better luck. Canterbury Cathedral is witness to his success.
He was made aware of the existence of England by seeing English slave boys for sale in the market in Rome, and was very struck by their un-Italian appearance. They didn't have dark hair, they were blonde, they were tall, and he asked who they were, where they came from. He was told that they were Angles, and he made a Latin pun, not Angles, but angels. At any rate, we know from his own correspondence that within 2 years before he actually sent missionaries to England, he was trying to buy slave boys to set them free and to put them into the Roman monasteries to be trained as monks. And that looks as if he was training translators.
A planned campaign then, led by Augustine, a rigid, unimaginative man. At least he had the good sense to seek guidance from Gregory, whose letters show flexibility and sympathy towards the native pagans.
Things are not to be loved for the sake of a place, but places are to be loved for the sake of their good things.
Added to good advice was practical support. More clerics and scholars came from the south. Singers, even the Pope's own choirmaster, was sent to make this a truly Roman church. Ultimately, the seed of Romanitas, planted by Gregory, would overcome the Celtic Church of the West. But there were other effects.
The conversion of England to a Roman type of Christianity with very strong links to the papacy, with an archbishop at Canterbury who is, in a sense, a direct delegate of the Pope, was to have enormous consequences for Christianity right across Western and Northern Europe. Because in the couple of centuries that followed the Gregorian mission to England, Englishmen, like the Devon-born St. Boniface, would go to Germany, they'd go to what we now call France, and would establish Episcopal Christianity with very strong links to Rome.
Far to the south of Britain, a different land with different problems. No missionary outpost this. Here the church had been established for some 400 years, but it was being torn apart by the age-old heresies about the nature of Christ's divinity. It was a land ripe for revolutionary change. Here lived a younger contemporary of Pope Gregory, whose life was to shatter Christianity. Born in Mecca, the Prophet Muhammad, founder of Islam. He brought a new and uncompromising message. God was one. There was no other. Like Christ, Muhammad ascended to heaven in Jerusalem. He was a prophet inspired, and his God, the God of the Muslims, Allah, was the same God as the God of Abraham and the God of Jesus Christ. A God not to be represented in pictures or statues. Pattern and color suffice. This stark new religion captured the Arab mind. The Christian world seemed powerless before it. Carthage fell. Alexandria fell. Once the greatest center of Christian learning, its churches were replaced by minarets and mosques. When Muhammad died in 632, his religion and his empire were confined to the Arabian desert. Even there, it was limited to the two cities of Mecca and Medina. In the next 12 years, his followers overwhelmed the Persian Empire and conquered the Byzantine lands of Syria and Egypt. Within 100 years, their conquest covered the whole of the North African coastline and Spain. The Mediterranean had turned into a Muslim lake. Its peoples turned against Christianity and Christians. Of the ancient centers of Christianity, only Rome offered a safe refuge. Greek monks and priests emigrated there in droves. That Greek community still exists in Rome. In the church of Santa Maria in Cosmedin, the Mass is still sung in Greek. It was then, as now, strictly Catholic, but it brought to Roman Christianity many of the values and attitudes of Byzantium. Then, at the very time when unity was needed to counter Islam, the church was again split by heresy. This time it centered on the will of Christ. Called monothelitism, it accepted that Jesus did have two natures, but only one will, the divine will. The emperor, in the search for unity, took it up with enthusiasm and tried to force it on Rome. One pope, Pope Martin, was made to suffer when he denounced all truck with this new heresy and was called to face the emperor.
He had a terrible nightmare voyage. He was racked with gout and dysentery. He was only allowed one bath in 3 months. He was only allowed on shore once. By the time he got to Constantinople, he was unable to stand. But he was put on trial for high treason. He was tried on the charge that he'd been complicit with the previous exarch, Olympius, in a bid to overthrow the emperor. He tried to raise the question of the heresy and was told this was not what he was being tried for at all. It was treason, and he was found guilty. He was then led outside, and in the face of the people and the emperor, he was stripped, flogged, had his head shaved, and was sent to prison, ready to be executed. The Patriarch of Constantinople intervened on his behalf, and the emperor relented and commuted the sentence to exile, and he was sent to the Crimea, where in 655 he died. Died, it has to be said, totally neglected and forgotten, because he'd hoped that Rome would refuse to accept his deposition. Instead, afraid that the emperor might proceed with more harsh measures against them, they accepted the deposition and promptly elected a new pope, an elderly, compliant, conciliatory figure called Eugenius I, who was not going to confront the emperor at all. And Martin, although hailed as a martyr, was really evidence that the emperor could get his own way with the papacy whenever he wanted.
East and West were drifting further apart. Ironically, the split was aggravated when, from the 670s, Rome had a series of Greek popes. They were Catholic of the Catholics and added to the Roman tradition a sharper hatred of heresy. Under them, the rift with the East widened. It became unbridgeable later with the controversy over icons. As Islam brought one disaster after another, theologians and rulers here in Byzantium became increasingly uneasy about the use of images. Were the Jews and Muslims right? Could it be that the calamities of the empire were God's judgment on Christians for disobeying the second commandment? Leo III, who became emperor in 717, came to believe this teaching and launched a vicious campaign against holy pictures. The opening of his campaign coincided with a terrifying volcanic eruption in the Aegean. Clouds of smoke and ash darkened the sky over Constantinople as the first images were broken. The result was the worst confrontation between Pope and Emperor there had ever been. Here in Nicaea, the Eastern Church tried to resolve matters. In Rome, the issues were clear-cut. Whilst the bishops and clerics met, Pope Gregory II wrote to the Emperor.
You have no right to issue dogmatic institutions. You have not the right mind for dogma. Your mind is too coarse and martial.
The Emperor's reply was coarse and martial. He confiscated all papal lands in southern Italy and Sicily, giving control of them to the Patriarch of Constantinople. The papacy had been cast out of the empire. For almost 500 years, the papacy had believed in one church and one empire. That empire had now turned its back on the Pope and taken from him these lands in the south, the main source of papal revenue gone. Its lands to the north, too, were now under threat from the Lombards again. In 739, they took over Ravenna. The old seat of imperial power in Italy was gone. The Lombards were squeezing the papacy to death. Isolated, alone, the Pope turned northwards to the Franks, the most powerful force in Western Europe.
Just at this time, there came a situation which actually worked to their advantage. The situation in France was that one family, the Carolingians, had the real power. They were the chief ministers. Another family, the Merovingians, were the kings. In title only, they had no power. Pippin the Short, the latest of the Carolingians, decided it was time for his family to become kings. So he petitioned the Pope, Pope Zacharias, and said, is it right that one man should reign and another man should rule? And the Pope said no. And on the basis of this, Pippin deposed the last Merovingian king, Childeric III, and bundled him off into a monastery and had himself crowned king. But he needed legitimization. And so in 754, the successor of Pope Zacharias, Stephen II, crossed the Alps and met in really a summit meeting with Pippin at Ponthieu, and they did a deal, basically. The Pope confirmed the transfer of sovereignty in France to the Carolingian family and anointed Pippin and his sons, and Pippin agreed to restore the conquered imperial provinces in Italy, but not to the empire, to the Pope.
A papal state had been created. It would endure in much this form for 1100 years. But by what right had the King of the Franks acted? There now emerged one of the most extraordinary documents of the Middle Ages. In the church of Quattro Coronati in Rome, the story is told in paintings. It goes back to the Emperor Constantine, who, suffering from a fatal illness, is told that the only cure is to wash himself in the blood of the innocents. When the children are brought, Constantine has pity on them and refuses the remedy. That night, he dreams of two men appearing to him. Next day, he sends out messengers to find Pope Sylvester. The messengers go out and climb the mountain of Montserrat, where the Pope is living as a hermit. They plead with Pope Sylvester to come down and visit Constantine. Sylvester comes and shows Constantine an icon, Peter and Paul. Constantine recognizes the men of his dreams, and he accepts to become a Christian. Then Constantine is baptized and is cured of his leprosy. In gratitude, he hands over to Pope Sylvester power over the western part of the empire. Leading the horse, Constantine now takes a secondary place, and Pope Sylvester is seated with all the symbols of imperial power. This extraordinary story was meant to provide a coherent basis for the claim that the papacy had received from Constantine imperial power over the West against Constantinople.
He'd done no such thing. This document was forged by the papal notaries just prior to Stephen II crossing the Alps, so he'd go wave this document and say, I have the power to transfer sovereignty to you, the Carolingians. And this was never known till the Renaissance, that this was a forgery, and it was the basis of much of the papacy's political power.
This is the Cathedral Church of Aachen, to the French Aix-la-Chapelle, the capital of the Franks. The throne of their king was here. With Pepin's death, enter his son, a colossus, the mighty Charlemagne. His political power extended over much of Western Europe. He captured the admiration of his day and has continued to haunt the European political imagination ever since. Since the conversion of the warrior King Clovis, the Franks had been Orthodox Catholics, unsullied by Arian heresies. The Church and the papacy held a high place in their minds. Charlemagne had been born and bred as a sincere son of St. Peter. He was also fascinated by the glamour of imperial Rome. He gladly accepted the role handed down to him from his father, patrician of the Romans, defender of the Pope. He not only confirmed the lands donated by his father, but extended them, giving the Pope some 2/3 of the Italian peninsula. He defied Constantinople, and his armies brought the Lombards to heel in Italy. The papacy was upbeat, assertive, and, under the King of the Franks, getting richer. But the same wealth plunged Rome into murderous rivalry as the ruling families squabbled for it. When Leo III was elected Pope, he alienated an important faction in Rome who had failed to get their man elected.
Ill will built up, and in 799, a gang attacked the Pope on his way to Mass, attempted to put out his eyes and take out his tongue, locked him up in a monastery, subjected him to ill treatment, and he was formally deposed on charges of perjury and adultery. But he escaped from the monastery, fled to Paderborn, and there he asked Charlemagne, the Frankish leader, to restore him to Rome. And Charlemagne accompanied him to Rome, held a council of the church where the Pope was allowed to take a formal oath saying that he was not guilty on the most solemn oath possible of these charges.
Charlemagne had been received at Rome with imperial honours, and Pope Leo had also won out against the conspirators who opposed him.
What do the conspirators do? You've tried to attack the Pope. You have attacked the Pope, and you've maimed him. Been unsuccessful, he's escaped. Wouldn't you escape before authority comes in? The conspirators waited quite complacently in Rome for Charlemagne to come down. Now, what were they trying to do, these conspirators? Members of this oligarchy, which Leo has blown aside, bypassed entirely in the administration of Rome. They were not trying to kill him. They were trying to disable him, to create a vacancy, a vacuum rather than a vacancy in the papacy, an inoperative pope who could neither see nor talk.
They had failed in their attempt, but Leo then took a remarkable step. On Christmas Day, when Charlemagne attended Mass at St. Peter's, the Pope placed a crown on his head and anointed him as emperor. Charlemagne later declared that his coronation had taken him by surprise and that he would never have agreed to it.
It was alleged at the time that he regretted it, and some historians used to think that he regretted it. The latest view is that he actually didn't regret it. He saw it was the logical and obvious thing to do. He saw that it gave him a status which he was now entitled to. And he set about behaving like an emperor, running the West like an emperor, and certainly treating the popes as if he was emperor. So I think the most recent evidence is that it was something that he was expecting and something that he wanted. And for people to say that he didn't want it, he was reluctant and so on, is to paint the picture of a hero who has power thrust upon him and has never really sought it.
But whatever the views of Charlemagne, the coronation did focus strongly on the role of the Pope in the matter.
I think it probable there's considerable evidence that Leo III, Bishop of Rome, the senior subject of the Byzantine Empire, thought that imperial power in this vacuum devolved on himself, and that it was his duty to find a layman, a warrior, actually to exercise it. Charles had expected a spontaneous acclamation of his preeminence in Western Europe, a tribute to himself. What Leo did was to crown Charlemagne and then lead him out for the acclamation of the Frankish warriors outside the church. So the constituent act was, as it were, Leo III as the father emperor, crowning his son to be the executive agent. And Charlemagne recognized this, that he had had, if you like, a fast one pulled on him. His preeminence had been subordinated to that of the Bishop of Rome.
Leo celebrated the partnership in these mosaics. Peter gives the pallium to Leo on the left. To Charlemagne, a spear and banner. Pope Leo had restored his power. Charlemagne was the new Constantine, an emperor appointed to protect and extend the faith under the guidance of the Pope. In the tradition of the Franks, there came a time to crown his son as his appointed successor. But Charlemagne was not to be tricked again. Charlemagne ensured that the coronation ceremony took place not in Rome, but in Aachen. His son placed the crown on his own head. For Charlemagne, imperial power came direct from God, not from any priest, not even the successor of Peter. The new empire erected by Charlemagne did not last. The papacy had lost its protector. It was left defenseless in the snake pit of Italian politics, where men were prepared to steal, rape and murder for St. Peter's seat. Some say that a woman became pope at this time, a Pope Joan. Her disguise was revealed when she gave birth to a son on a papal procession. At least that's the story. Needless to say, she is not recognized in the accepted list of popes. She defies the imagination. So do some of the true stories of the period. One who suffered was Pope Formosus. After his death, his successor had him dug up and put on trial in Rome.
A series of charges of corruption, bribery, simony of buying sacred things were levelled against the Pope. The trial went on for several days. He was found guilty. He was stripped of his pontifical vestments. The fingers that he'd used in blessing and ordination were hacked from his corpse, and his body was thrown into the Tiber.
The Roman populace, dispirited by the events, turned on Stephen, who was deposed, strangled in prison, and his body thrown to follow Formosus in the Tiber.
The papacy became the plaything of rival noble factions in Rome, and for quite a long time was in the personal gift of two ambitious, unscrupulous and immoral women, Theodore and Marozia. The situation is evidenced by the fact, that, for instance, that Pope John XI, who was made pope in his 20s, was the illegitimate son of Marozia by Pope Sergius III. Virtually none of them died in their beds. Many of them came to horribly sticky ends.
John VIII was bludgeoned to death by his own entourage. Leo V, murdered by his successor. John X, suffocated to death. Stephen VIII, horribly mutilated. Eventually, Marozia, the grand schemer, the whore of the popes, was arrested and imprisoned in Castel San Angelo. She was to remain imprisoned here for over 50 years. She had turned 60 when news reached her that her grandson Octavian had become pope at the ripe old age of 18. He did nothing to save her. The first pontiff to change his name, he became John XII, and within weeks, monasteries prayed for his death. He had invented sins, the monks said, not known since the beginning of time. It was alleged that he gambled with the offerings of pilgrims, turned the Lateran to a harem, rewarded harlots with golden chalices, and before the high altar, toasted the devil. He died, aged 27, from a stroke while in bed with a married woman. It was the most degrading nadir of papal history. Things could only improve.